Welcome to This Week in Local, a Locology podcast featuring lively conversations about the local digital ecosystem, hosted by Locology analysts Mike Boland and Charles Lachlan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Local. I'm Mike Boland, and my guest today is Damian Rollison, who's Director of Market Insight at SOCi. So, Damian, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mike. I'm glad to be here again.
Yeah, I should say welcome back to the show. So anyway, we have a lot to talk about, but first, for the sake of context, tell us a bit about yourself and your role at SOCi for those that are unfamiliar.
Sure. So I've been in local marketing for, I guess, about 20 years. It's getting pretty close to that now, and seen them come and go, as they say. For the last several years, it'll be 3 years with SOCi, but then SOCi did a big acquisition 3 years ago, which I came in as part of. So I've actually been working with the same team for a bit longer, somewhere around the 7-year mark at this point. And I've done product development. I've done different things in my career. What I do right now is market research and, just kind of keeping tabs on what's happening in the market. In fact, I think you mentioned in the last episode we did together that I was sort of an honorary business analyst, which is a decent way to characterize the things that I focus on. But I sort of try to keep tabs on what's happening with Google algorithms and local platforms and advising brands in terms of how to compete. And especially SOCi's focus is multi-location brands. We're a platform that does search, reputation, and social at the local level with a primary focus on brands that have multiple brick and mortar locations, either regionally or throughout the country or even throughout the world.
Yeah. Yes, the secret society of the Analyst Corps. Your hand's been stamped. You can come and go as an honorary member. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Anyway, so let's jump into it. And for the sake of continuity, I'll remind our audience that this is essentially part 2 of our discussion with you, Damian. And there was so much good stuff to cover that we decided to, for the sake of focus, do 2 episodes. And that first episode, to catch our audience up to speed, we discussed some original SOCi findings with respect to AI's impact on search and the varying performance of some competitive offerings from Google and others. And anyone is encouraged to go check out that episode. It's episode 74 for anyone interested. So now we're switching gears to talk about a separate piece of original research from the minds at SOCi. And this one is about long-tail syndication, which is sort of an unsung but important aspect of local SEO. So to start, for those unfamiliar with this concept, tell us about the report, its scope, its methodology, and if you could define long-tail syndication for those unfamiliar. And we'll get into the findings, but just at a high level, what's this report all about?
Yeah. So thanks for teeing that up. I think it's probably useful to begin by telling a little story that actually reflects a little bit of the history that I've lived through with the local SEO space and the changes that we've, gone through, which are pretty significant, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. And so, you mentioned the theme of our last conversation was the impact of generative AI in search, and in particular, our other study looked at the impact of generative AI on local search. And, we found that, Google was really a dominant player in local. They've really cornered that market. But if you dial back the clock more than a decade, there was a time when Google was still an emerging player in local. They had a great product, but they didn't have a lot of data. They didn't have a lot of businesses who understood that they needed to claim and manage their online presence in their Google profiles, which used to be called Google My Business, and it had different names before that. Now it's called Google Business Profiles. Anyway, in that early period, there was a concept called citation building, which was a powerful tool in the arsenal of local SEO practitioners, which was going to help your business rank well in Google search. Because Google didn't have a lot of direct participation. There was even a time when businesses could not claim and update their listings at all in Google. Rather, Google relied on secondary sources of information. We call them data aggregators in order to populate those local listings. And they also used their very powerful ability to index the web in order to check for business listings on online directory sites. You might remember we used to call them IYPs, or Internet Yellow Page sites like Superpages or yellowpages.com or City Search or MapQuest. We remember those of us who've been around, as once they were big destination sites for consumers, and also index points for Google to reference to figure out, hey, is this, Mexican restaurant on 4th Street, is this really their phone number? Well, let's see what these other sites say. And the more sites with the same information, the greater the vote for the authority of that information, and therefore the more confidence Google had in terms of ranking the business. So when we talk about long tail syndication in local SEO, it's about blanketing the internet with references to your business. We tend to call those structured citations, which is an online mention of your business, usually including your name, address, and phone number. We used to call that NAP or NAP. That is easily indexed and that can be used, again, as a vote in favor of the authority of that information and for the purpose of ranking in Google. And, back in the day, I actually went back and found the local search ranking factors for 2010, back when the founder of that report, David Mim, was still in charge of it. It was the second year or third year, I guess, of its existence. And in that time frame, volume of citations from major data providers and IYP portals, as the phrasing went, was the fourth most impactful ranking factor. So it was in the top 10, and citations showed up elsewhere as well. So we knew that this was a way that businesses could rank, and lots of companies built businesses on citation building, long tail syndication as a kind of a synonym of that. The ability to get to that broad base of syndication sites more quickly, more directly, covering a broader range of them, was a big differentiating factor. And lots of brands and lots of SMBs who heard the marketing messages and the advice from the local SEO community absorbed this idea that this was a kind of a silver bullet to getting yourself visible in Google search. But a lot has changed since 2010. And the very same local search ranking factors report, which was handed off by David to Darren Shaw from Whitespark a few years ago, but still continues to be produced on a sort of annual basis. The last one was in 2023. It's been tracking the changes over time in these local search ranking factors. And the two big things to call out that have changed are that Google itself has grown in importance significantly, and citations have, in a sort of a parallel move, declined significantly in importance year over year. And so that now they're a fairly small factor, even in the minds of people who contribute to this report, whose companies were built on citation building. So we know that Google has grown in importance. We all know it as consumers because we see so much Google so many Google products in the SERP real estate. Yeah. So, we don't go to dictionary.com to look up a word anymore. We just Google define whatever the word is, and it shows up in search for us as a featured snippet or a featured answer. We know you're familiar, I'm sure, Mike, with the research that Rand Fishkin did on zero-click search, which found that about 2/3 of the time the clicks stay on Google and not out to the wider web. Right. And similarly, businesses have become acclimated to the idea that they need to manage their listings directly in their Google profiles. So for all of these combined reasons, Google no longer needs citations as a primary central source of data. If it has any influence at all, it's pretty minor at this point.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for the context and that sort of that walk down memory lane in the local SEO space. Maybe we'll score this segment of the podcast with some music from like 2010. Anyway, you're right that this is, I think, really part and parcel or sort of a microcosm of the larger trend of Google relying less on third-party data and also displaying less third-party data in the user-facing touchpoint, which of course is the SERP. So it stands to reason. So based on all of that, what is the takeaway in terms of local SEOs, in terms of agencies, in terms of in-house marketers, in terms of what they should be doing, spending their time, presumably no longer on long tail syndication, but more sort of direct optimization with their Google business profiles? What's the takeaway for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, at SOCi, I mentioned that local search management, listing management, as we used to call it, I think that term is kind of gradually dying really at this point.
Yeah.
But that, local search marketing is a big focus of what we do. It's one of our, pillar offerings in our platform. And we too, like many other companies, have built a platform that can syndicate your listings out to many, many sites. And we do that directly. We do that through aggregator relationships. We understand that there is a kind of a expectation within the people who we work with as clients and partners that this used to be a very important thing and it may still have an impact. And so we've built that as a offering as well, just like many others, but it's not our priority and it's not our focus. What we focus on is Google itself and a few other core platforms that can stand alongside Google as having a secondary importance that's significant. So I would point to Bing, for example. There's really no reason why you would want to neglect Bing as a platform, even though its traffic by comparison to Google is not large. It's still way larger than City Search, if you take my point. And therefore, it needs to be covered. It needs to be checked off on the checkbox. Apple Maps is another one, which I would argue is even more important than Bing, given that it's the incumbent navigation app on the iPhone. Lots of people are going to end up using it and encountering business information there. You want yours to be accurate and to stand out.
It's on 1.5 billion iOS devices globally.
Absolutely. Yelp is still important. Yelp reviews still show up in Apple Maps listings along with many other places, alongside the Yelp platform itself. And Facebook, surprisingly, and other social sites are kind of emerging here, but Facebook is still a popular platform for engaging with and discovering and even searching for local businesses across many age demographics. So all of those are more important than the long tail syndication sites of yesterday's SEO. Those are the ones that we really want to emphasize. The reason we did the study was because we wanted to kind of put to rest for ourselves and for others any lingering idea as to whether those priorities are in fact the correct ones, because we do hear a lot still about, we have the biggest network, we have the most sites, we have, sites across this, broad range. And isn't that the method that is ultimately going to win? Just the sort of, mass syndication approach. It sounds good at first. But we thought it really was something that the data ought to support if, in fact, those claims were true.
Yeah. So putting the idea to rest is interesting. It seems that what you've sort of done here is essentially a public service announcement in terms of, SEO is always, the SEO practice is always sort of a lagging indicator to SEO, best practices, which of course are reflective of the dynamic nature of the algorithm itself, because SEO is the art of reverse engineering the algorithm. So it's dynamic, it's always changing. So, getting people to adapt faster seems like it's sort of the name of the game. So to that end, are you finding that there are still a lot of folks out there that are, doing this, arguably outdated practice, and sort of who are they?
You mean in terms of businesses who are,
Long tail syndication, optimization, those that are still, chasing those third party sites, even though it's no longer as potent as it used to be.
yeah, well, without calling out any specific names,
Sure, sure.
there are companies and individual practitioners who have a little bit perhaps more skin in the game on that topic, who have built these broad networks and consider them to be a unique differentiator for them, and
Sure.
who also may believe, I mean, local SEO is complicated, and there are legitimate differences of opinion out there. So I definitely don't want to discount the people who have years of experience working with small business clients and others who may feel that a range of tactics can be effective given the situation. I should mention, in the most recent local search ranking factors study, which I was citing earlier, there are quotes from multiple local SEO practitioners about factors that are more important now, factors that are less important now. Many people did, when they were asked what is one thing that is less impactful than it used to be. Many people did mention citation building as something that is less impactful, but not everybody agreed. That's one of the nice things about local search ranking factors, that it attempts to represent a consensus of the community, but there are legitimate differences of opinion, and there are also edge cases. One of the points that was made was that when a business moves from one location to another, sometimes citation building can help to ensure that Google properly recognizes the new location.
Ah, makes sense.
Okay, fine. Edge case, that sounds legit to me. On a day-to-day basis, it's not the basket you should put all your eggs in, is kind of
Right.
the point that
Yeah.
I'm making, especially in a contemporary sense.
Yeah. So let's merge the topic of part one of our discussion and this. Like, we were talking a lot last time about AI and its impact on search. And one of the ongoing concerns with AI is that um, it's based on, the information that is out there. It's, training data. So the validity of sort of source data becomes even more and more important. Does that weigh in here when we're talking about more sort of primary first party sort of optimization on the large networks, when sort of AI based search or AI fueled search is increasingly playing a part in the web today? Or if not that, what are some of the ways that there are sort of intersecting points to this long tail syndication discussion and the emergence of AI in search?
Yeah, I will speak to that, and I think before I even make any claims at all, I should say that this is a complicated question, and
Sure.
there's really no way to answer it definitively in terms of what generative AI is going to look for or need as it's accessing the broader internet to answer questions. And also, we've seen it's a very active debate right now that even Google, which ought to be in some ways the best at finding the right answer by scanning the internet, has been surfacing some answers to questions that are probably not what the designers intended,
Mhm.
referencing obscure comments on Reddit and elsewhere that are meant to be jokes as though they were serious. There's a lot of bumpiness before the real picture emerges, which, if you've been around long enough, was also true with SEO, right?
Yep. Yep.
So, where it will not settle down for a little while here. But that original study that we talked about in the last episode was about how do different platforms respond when you ask them local search oriented questions. And we found that for the most part, if they can respond to them well, and Google Gemini, and at the time SGE, which is now public as AI overviews in its new version, or the more public version of it. Anyway, at the time, and I think still those were the strongest at answering local queries. And that's primarily because they referenced Google Maps as a
Sure.
source. They
Makes
didn't
sense.
go elsewhere. The weakest was surprisingly ChatGPT, which didn't really understand the concept of what does it mean to locate the user before answering their question. So it couldn't really do that. And it might have had a tendency to go to more surprising sources, although for the most part for us, it actually just went to the brand website if it could, and to look for information about local businesses. But I would say it was in its earliest, most naive or untrained state in for local search in comparison with any of the other platforms. So we have a whole table of where we could figure out the source of the data for each of the platforms for a local query. What was that source? And the larger story is that it's Google Maps or Google Business Profiles itself, other major platforms like Yelp. The same ones that I've been reciting as priorities are the ones that the generative AI platforms that are the most mature in local search are in fact referencing. So it's nice to be able to say that our recommendation of what the priorities ought to be aligns with these contemporary developments with AI. And I would argue that that's likely to continue into the future, even though so many other things about AI in search are still uncertain.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a moving target and something that's going to be exciting to continue watching. So we'll definitely do that. Now, I want to briefly talk about Apple because you mentioned Apple. And when you were talking about the history of Google and in its early days, it relied a lot on third party data before it started to collect a lot of its own first party local business details and listings data. And it seems like that's where Apple Maps is now. Now, Apple Maps is a sleeping giant. It's a behemoth. As I mentioned, it's on more than 1.5 billion Mac OS and iOS devices. But it seems that its data strategy is very much similar to that sort of early Google strategy, which is to aggregate data from third parties. Until
Mm-hmm.
recently, it seems that we're now at an inflection where Apple is sort of stepping towards that same evolutionary path that Google once did by starting to collect data directly in a first party sense. So
Mm-hmm.
Apple Business Connect, I'm sure you're aware of it, is its sort of answer to Google Business Profiles, where it's now
Mm-hmm.
collecting that data. So it's interesting to see Apple at an earlier stage of that evolutionary path, because mapping is not a primary thing for Apple, but nonetheless sort of following that same pattern several years later. So I wonder if that's going to be something that we start to see as a larger and larger competitive threat to Google Maps, not just on the user end, but in terms of mind share for businesses spending their time on the sort of back end offering to make sure all their information is updated. I'm not sure if you spend any time with Apple Maps or have any opinion there, but that's something we're watching closely.
Well, we're an Apple Maps partner, and we feed data directly into Apple Maps, and actually have been doing that for many years. It's
Nice.
interesting to note that their first orientation toward partnering with companies like ours was in the multi-location or enterprise space. In fact, they used to call those partnerships enterprise partners. I'm not sure if that word still is still used, but
Yeah.
so they were very multi-location focused. I think that was the mindset was that they could get the biggest bulk of information the most quickly if they worked with multi-location brands. But their challenge, they did have a prior iteration of the SMB portal.
Mhm.
And now that's been kind of renewed with a little extra marketing impetus behind it. The challenge has been, getting small businesses involved, getting them to participate, getting people to have that same level of awareness as people now have with Google, that this is a critical thing, not just an optional one. It's interesting to note, I don't think the analogy is probably perfect to being at the same early point that Google was, because of several different factors that are, pretty obvious. And I have this in my mind too, because WWDC, of course, just happened,
Mhm.
and they made these announcements around the which were anticipated around the integration of Chat GPT into Siri. which is interesting because it represents possibly this competitive threat against Google, which pays a lot of money to be the incumbent search platform in Apple Maps. And yet there's Apple Maps itself, the native product built by that company, sitting in the middle of that mix. Um, it's not as clear to me that Apple has that as a strategic priority, nor has the right kind of ecosystem, given its reliance on those kinds of partnerships, to really make the same kind of broad push that Google was able to make. The other, obvious point I would call out is that Apple does not have a desktop presence. That may be less important now, right? But the desktop presence leads to a ubiquity, which then ends up meaning that Google is there on the Android and the iPhone because it's on the web. You see what I mean? So, and that of course predates, the rise of mobile as the dominant, entry point to the internet. But all of that to me says that Apple's in a difficult position, if indeed it wants to become that dominant, which is also not clear to me in terms of the strategic moves that they've made.
Yeah, I mean, Maps is not a revenue center. It's like a lot of Apple products and like a lot of Google products for that matter, sort of loss leaders to drive the core business. And for Apple, that's selling hardware. For Google, that's driving people towards their monetizable products, first of which being search. But and a lot of that speaks on the user end in terms of market share and mind share for users. On the sort of SMB mind share and multi-location brand mind share, it's interesting too, is if you look at what are the motivating factors that cause that these companies sort of communicate of like why you need to show up and make sure your stuff's accurate, make sure it's updated. For Google, it's sort of the dangling carrot of SEO or the stick. I mean, it's both the carrot and the stick when it comes to SEO. For Apple, it could be a different but equally potent message, which is, sort of what I alluded to earlier, which is we are so present, we come sort of preloaded, even though that doesn't necessarily guarantee active usage. We are preloaded with, on deck positioning on, so many global devices. So sheer numbers wise, it's worth your time to show up and do it here as well.
It's very interesting what you were referencing a second ago about the core missions of the two companies. And to be real simplistic about it, Apple's core mission is to sell devices. Google's core mission is to be the best information provider.
Yep.
And if you just, be very simple like that, you will see that local, even though it is a loss leader, as you say, for Google. And by the way, we, the SMB community especially would love to get better support from Google for its local products. It's not necessarily an easy platform to use.
Yeah.
It comes with lots of frustrations, and part of the reason we exist is to be able to broker with Google to get things done. And yet it is much, much, much closer to their core mission. That said, that said, I don't think I also don't think that Apple's going to abandon local because, again, within that sort of slightly narrower context of needing a solution on the phone that's a native solution, it's not going to go away anytime soon. And so it's in that kind of middle position, which I think is going to guarantee that it remains a secondary player, but also guarantee that it's an important secondary player, one that you have to pay attention to if you're trying to market yourself as a business.
Yeah, you're right that Maps is much closer to the center of Google. A better example of a loss leader for Google, and it has many, is perhaps Gmail or Google Voice, and a lot of these just great utilities that are free. So anyway, sort of winding down here, I want to sort of emphasize one point we made earlier, which is this is sort of just like a great public service announcement in terms of its data, its message. So sort of in that spirit, in getting the word out, what are your sort of goals for this data? What do you want to leave our audience with in terms of the message? And obviously this is, SOCi's thought leadership that is being sort of blasted out into the world. And hopefully that brings some of that optimization work back to your doorstep, which is all very fair and strategic. But what do you want to sort of leave our audience with in terms of the message?
Yeah, I would say that, most of the time when we study things, we're trying to find evidence of of tactics and strategies that we should be doing more of. It's unusual that we would produce a study that is about how something doesn't work. So this is a bit of an anomaly in that sense. But the reason we did it is really just to provide clarity, because I believe there is still a lot of noise out there in the local SEO universe around this topic. And, by the way, I don't mean to pretend that it's the definitive word on this topic. It's an active debate and continues to be an active debate.
Sure.
We did have some nice endorsements, including from David Mim when the study came out. So I'm happy to see that people see value in it. But we want to be a part of that conversation however we can. We will even continue to monitor the group of businesses that we included in the study. I didn't talk too much about the methodology, Mike, and of course people can go and read if you go to meetsoci.com. Under our resources tab, there's a area called Insights, and the report is sitting right there. Or we can provide a link. I don't know if that we'll do that, but
we can do that in the show notes. Easy.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. As for the ongoing discussion and debate around this topic, we're excited to be a part of that. We will continue watching and listening. I'm excited also to continue to mine the report itself for sort of editorial nuggets that we'll continue covering. But in the meantime, that's all the time we have, and I want to thank you, Damian, for joining us. This has been very enlightening.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone, for listening. This has been This Week in Local. Stay tuned every week for more episodes. You can find the show on all major podcast networks and find out more at locology.com. So please subscribe, like, and comment. Your engagement helps others find us. And if you're interested in being a guest or sponsor, you can email us at podcast@locology.com. So I'm Mike Bolin. My co-host is Charles Laughlin. Our producer is Dara Sweat. And this week's guest has been Damian Rollison. You can find out more about Damian and SOCi in the show notes. So thanks for listening, and see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Locology's This Week in Local with Mike Bolin and Charles Laughlin. Be sure to subscribe for more.